Welcome back. You're watching Your World at 10. Now, over the last few days, the government has been taking various measures to mitigate the impact of the drought, with nearly half the districts in the country suffering from deficient rainfall. The minimum support price has been hiked for various food items, and the government says it is open to imports if domestic produce falls short of demand. What more can the government do? Joining us to discuss that are two veterans in this space, Yogendra Alag, the chairman of the Institute of Rural Management in Anand, or IRMA that is, and Ashok Desai, consultant editor of The Telegraph. Well, Professor Alag, Mr. Desai, thank you very much for joining me. Let me start by asking you about the impact of the recent bout of rainfall that we've seen in the last week to 10 days. Has that, in a sense, reduced the gloomy prospects of lower GDP? Professor Alag, when, about a month ago, when we first faced the spectre of drought, there were many equity analysts that had shaven off approximately between 75 basis points to over 1%, in GDP for this year. Do you think this recent bout of rainfall will help mitigate or minimize that impact?
I think it was, in any case, premature at this stage to have shaved off a large part, something like a percentage or even half a percentage point of GDP. Please remember that although there has been deficient rainfall of the magnitude of 25 to 30%, now a little lower, as you say, but as far as a lot of the worst hit districts are fully irrigated, like in Haryana, parts of Punjab, and most certainly western UP. Now, if it rains as it has rained now, and if it rains until the middle of September and the reservoirs fill up better, and we know that the Rabi is not going to be a very good Rabi because retained moisture in the soil will not be there. But if the reservoirs are well, we may have a near normal Rabi. In this case, I think shaving off quantums from the GDP is a little premature anyway. I think the last week's rainfall is probably not going to affect Kharif in any significant manner. It will affect the reservoirs once the data comes in, which means better irrigation prospects in the Rabi.
Mr. Desai, would you agree with that? And is there any way to assess, now that we've had some recovery in the rainfall, marginal as it may be, assess the impact on growth for the country over the course of the next 12 months?
Well, what the drought did was to reduce the sown area. The sown area went down by about 15%. That doesn't necessarily mean that the total production would go down by 15%, but Kharif is likely to be lower than normal. The share of agriculture in GDP is 18%. So if 5% of agricultural production were lost, that would mean 1% to GDP. So 1% doesn't look too unreasonable to me. But I would agree with Yogendra that people are making predictions far too early on far too little data. We really have to look at the whole agricultural year and not just at 3 weeks or 4 weeks.
Mr. Desai, would you say that while their hopes are minimal on the Kharif end, there is an enhanced sense of hope on the Rabi end now that we've had some recovery in the rainfall? And how would you assess the prospects for the Rabi crop?
As Yogendra said, a lot of the Rabi crop is irrigated and therefore is unlikely to be affected by the drought. I myself think that the Rabi crop will be normal or close to normal. It's only the Kharif crop which is likely to be affected, and that is important because the crops that are grown in Kharif and Rabi are quite different. A lot of rice is grown in Kharif and is likely to be affected. Wheat is grown entirely in Rabi and is likely to be much less affected. Oilseeds are grown in Kharif and will be affected, and so also lentils. In fact, I'm quite sure that the lentil production this year will be enormously deficient.
All right, let me come then to the government's ability to mitigate some of this drought impact. And Professor Alag, what do you make of the many noises that you've heard both from the Ministry of Agriculture as well as from the government when it comes to, helping cash-strapped farmers? Do you think that, there is enough being done on the front of mitigating drought impact?
You see, the major mitigating effect of the action required is on drinking water and on fodder. It's not so much the question of aggregate output. If you ask me, by now the Kharif output is almost entirely determined. And as Ashok told you, we will take a knock in the Kharif. How much still remains to be seen, but oil seeds and pulses will most certainly be affected, as also rice. But we have had years when Kharif was down by 4 to 5% and Rabi was normal, and the GDP was not affected at all by agriculture. So the only thing I think they can do now for Kharif is partly to see that supplies of things like pesticides and fertilizer are there, particularly since the drought is most affecting areas in the Deccan Plateau and in the hills and in the east, where supply lines tend to get clogged. The only other thing I think they can probably do, they will, I'm more or less sure, they will ask the CACP to look into the additional cost of irrigation because of the drought, particularly in Punjab, Haryana and Western UP. It would be better if they do it now, because then the farmer can take that into account in his last fertilizer application and so on. And I think you also need to manage your imports in a way that you can meet the supply lines. And Ashok is quite right. This year we will need to import pulses and oil seeds in a big way. But you also need to give the farmer an assurance that in the Rabi there will be a good economic environment for him. You can do a lot more for the Rabi, but your question is on the Kharif, so I'll stop there.
No, you can add to that what you think should be done for the Rabi, because that's one crop that we can attempt to salvage the maximum available, possibility.
Well, in the Rabi, the first thing that you need to do now is to see to it that water supply, you need to give specific instructions that the reservoirs and tanks have to be managed well. First priority for drinking water, and then you save the water for the crops. The second thing is to declog the lower level systems, which may mean doing repairs, lower level canals, things of that kind. I would do that on a very massive scale. It has been done earlier, and we should try and do as much as we can, although it's getting a little late now.
Mr. Desai, would you like to add to that and maybe also comment on managing our existing food stocks better? Because that's one area many experts have said will require, again, efforts on a war footing to ensure that our large stocks that we have do not rot, are better distributed, and therefore can help keep prices lower at the consumer end.
Well, what I would do is to tell the minister who is in charge of food stocks that as soon as prices rise, he must start selling. In other words, he should not let prices rise at all. It's perfectly possible to stabilize food prices this year. We have enormous food stocks. Our Yoginder is really, I would say, a trade unionist on the side of farmers and is fond of raising prices all the time. I am really for the consumers, and I would say let's stabilize prices. It's not necessary to raise prices at all.
All right. Would you like to quickly add, Mr. Desai, what else you think the government can do to help mitigate this drought impact?
I think the biggest problem is going to be cattle. There's going to be a great shortage of cattle feed, and cattle will have to move from areas of drought to areas where there is more water and fodder, and the government should really prepare for that. It happened in a very big way in 1987 during the drought. Lots of cattle died at that time, and that is something we should be worrying about most.
All right, gentlemen, I know that this topic can actually consume many hours of discussion. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But Mr. Desai, Professor Alak, thank you very much for joining us on Your World at 10. With that, we need